Welcome to Isabella True Crime Meaning Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. The morning exhaled cold onto the window of my small loft, restrained but persistent. Every day began the same: a cup of strong coffee, warm milk, the soft sound of raindrops trickling down the glass. I sat in the kitchen, absorbed in this moment, which was almost sacred to me. A simple morning, a simple life after everything that had happened. I had learned to appreciate these small moments of solitude, their silent atmosphere. But today was different. Anxiety quietly, almost imperceptibly seeped into every cell of my body. And suddenly, as if in response to my silent unease, the door swung open. He entered. Edward, my nephew, the boy who once lived with me, now a grown man, had returned to my life. His appearance was as unexpected as light piercing through dark clouds at the moment of deepest shadow. I heard him drop his bag on the floor, say something like "I'm home," and shrug off his jacket. That same voice, once filled with childhood worries and hopes, now sounded with confidence. He had grown, but to me he remained the same young man who once held my hand and asked about life, about the world. He turned to face me, and for a moment I felt everything in this house fall back into place. We stood facing each other, and I didn't know how to behave. His eyes, they were full of some new foreign depths to me, and I couldn't figure out how to relate to this person who had once been my nephew and now entered my life with the same look as before, but with an entirely new feeling. "Hi," he said, smiling. But I noticed a note of uncertainty in his voice. He didn't know how we were going to interact now, what our communication would look like. I nodded, unsure of what to say. It felt strange to sense something familiar returning to your life, but now it was no longer the same as before. He approached the kitchen and began inspecting the shelves as if he had never left so confidently, so assuredly that it made me uneasy. My fingers continued to wrap around the coffee cup, but my gaze was fixed on him. He was different yet so familiar. Every morning I felt again and again how his presence changed the usual course of things. Edward had lived with me before when he was a teenager, and at that time I wasn't just an aunt to him. I was a pillar, a source of comfort. Now he had become a grown, confident man, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was increasingly occupying my space, which had once been solely mine. In his eyes, there was no longer that restless search, that invisible question that had once been on his face when he came to me for advice. Instead, he looked self-sufficient, confident in himself. His movements had become so precise and assured, as though he had a right to occupy this place. It seemed like he was making himself at home, recreating it, yet destroying something important in the process. We could no longer sit silently sipping coffee and chatting about trivial things as we once did. Everything he did reminded me that he was now an adult, and I was no longer the person I had been before. One day I woke up again to the smell of toasted bread filling the kitchen. It was his hand moving across the kitchen counter, preparing his breakfast. I couldn't figure out what bothered me more in that moment, his independence, or the way I had stopped being the master of my own space. We had become like three neighbors, not because I wanted it, but because reality was changing us. He was home, but something had changed. I often noticed how he found his corner, retreated to his room, spending time alone, and I too sought my inner corner where I could be myself. We had both stopped being the people we had been before, and it was not just noticeable. It was painful. "Don't you want to try this coffee?" he asked one morning, handing me a cup as if everything were as it had been before. He was still the same Edward who could simply care for others, but now he was different too. I didn't answer right away, but took the cup. He had become the way he was before, caring, but at the same time very distant. When he left for work I could feel the house emptying, but at the same time when he returned, I felt his presence filling the space with something new, something alien. It was like a gradual return to an old, uncomfortable reality that I couldn't avoid. But what troubled me the most was this. I couldn't shake the feeling that this process was pulling me farther away from myself. The days, like shadows, stretched behind us, but I couldn't find peace. Each day began with a familiar cup of coffee, and then, as if I were on autopilot, I would prepare breakfast for both of us. Edward sat at the kitchen table, slowly sipping his coffee and probably running through everything he might be thinking in the silence. I didn't know what he felt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that invisible threads hung between us, growing tauter with each passing day. We sat at the table and I again caught myself staring at him, unable to recognize him. Edward had become so grown up, so confident. Once he had been a teenager who didn't know what to do with himself, someone who sought protection and advice. Now he was independent, taking control of his life. His gaze had become more thoughtful, each of his thoughts now carefully considered. I could feel how these changes trailed behind us, altering the space we once shared. In the evenings we talked, it seemed like our conversations had become fewer. More and more often there was silence. He would retreat to his room and I would continue with my tasks as always. But something had shifted in our home. His presence had become sharp, piercing, like a pointed corner in a painting I was trying to create. We were so close yet at the same time so far apart. One day as we sat at the table again, he suddenly looked up and said, "I know you feel uncomfortable. I feel it too, but let's just live here like we used to. I'll try not to invade your space." I didn't answer immediately. I didn't want to speak because I didn't know what to say. I couldn't go back to the times when he was just a boy who needed my attention, and I couldn't be sure I was ready to accept him for who he was now. No matter how hard I tried to ignore what was happening between us, I knew this wasn't just an uncomfortable period of adjustment. It was something more, something that was becoming more and more apparent each day, something impossible to ignore. That evening when Edward and I decided to play cards again, the tension between us became almost palpable. We sat side by side and his breathing, quiet and steady, seemed to fill the space around us. I watched his hands deftly move the cards as if he didn't notice my gaze, as if everything was ordinary and natural. But for me it was something entirely different, a game that was beginning to lose its familiar meaning. I had long grown accustomed to the silence between us. We didn't talk much, didn't discuss anything important. But in that moment when his hand accidentally brushed against mine, something inside me seemed to snap. That barely noticeable gesture, so insignificant to anyone else, became something unexpected and powerful for me. I felt a chill run down my spine and a strange anxious knot formed in my C*******T. He didn't notice how his hand barely touched mine, but I remained frozen in that moment. He apologized so quickly that I barely had time to understand what he said, but his face was different. It didn't show the usual unease. No. There was a tense chuckle in his expression, mixed with confusion, with doubt, as if the gesture itself had surprised him. We both remained silent. I lifted my gaze and met his eyes, and then the room became so quiet that I almost heard my heart beating. There was something in his gaze that was so new, so incomprehensible. I felt like I should say something, explain, but words didn't come. Everything happening between us suddenly felt so strange that I felt confusion engulf me entirely. I tried to distance myself to pretend it didn't mean anything. But his presence beside me was so dense that it didn't allow me to hide from what was unfolding. He began to lean toward me and the movement was too quick for me to react. In that moment, his face was so close to mine that I could feel his breath. It was a closeness that wasn't familiar. It wasn't warm, it wasn't safe. I froze, and in that moment he kissed me. His lips barely touched mine, as if he wasn't even sure about what was happening. It was so unexpected that I felt everything inside me tighten. I couldn't understand what had shaken me. It wasn't a gesture of love and there was no desire. It was something else. It was a moment when something was broken, when what had been between us became impossible and the boundaries that had always existed vanished for an instant. I felt the air in the room change. He too froze, not knowing what to do next. We both remained silent and the thick silence became more and more painful. His gaze was full of embarrassment and confusion, and I couldn't say a word. Everything I felt was complex, shame, bewilderment, but at the same time a strange impulse. We both knew this moment wasn't just a mistake. It was something much more serious than we could have imagined. I stood up, not knowing what to do. He looked at me, his eyes full of apologies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything that had happened had already left a mark. I could have left immediately, could have said something hurtful, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. We both knew we couldn't return to the point where everything was simple, where there was no tension, where there were no questions. We couldn't ask ourselves. I quickly rose without saying a word and went to my room, leaving him sitting at the table as if nothing had happened. But something invisible hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything that had been before this moment had changed. The morning came, but it was no longer the same as before. The house was cold and empty, even though Edward was nearby. He always got up first as he used to prepare breakfast for himself, but today his movements were cautious, as if he were afraid of doing something wrong. I sat at the table feeling the pull of this strange emptiness, as if the air had become thick, saturated with the unspoken. Every time his gaze accidentally met mine, I felt something tighten in my C******T. We were both stiff and it was so unfamiliar. We had become strangers and there was no way to change that. Thought swirled in my head, but they wouldn't form a complete picture. This wasn't just awkwardness after the kiss, it was much deeper than that. We both knew that we couldn't go back to what we once were, and it was terrifying to think that everything we knew about ourselves and each other had become impossible. He tried to avoid me, which was even more painful. Everything that was happening between us defied explanation, and despite his efforts to be distant, every movement he made seemed full of questions. I tried to understand what I was supposed to do with this feeling, but it only grew like an insurmountable wall that couldn't be escaped. After several days of silence and clumsy attempts to keep a conversation going, I decided we needed to talk, not only because I could feel we were both stuck in this deadlock, but also because I realized that if we didn't talk, things would only get worse. That evening I brought dinner as usual and placed it on the table. But this time I couldn't allow myself to stay silent. It was no longer just a desire to return to normal. It was something necessary, like a breath of air I had been missing. "Edward," I said, sitting across from him, "we need to talk. I know what happened and I know it changed everything." I continued trying to speak calmly, though my voice cracked. "I understand that it was a mistake, but we need to figure this out. We can't keep going as if nothing happened." I didn't know what to do either. I didn't expect it to turn out like this. It was a mistake and I realized that. But his voice softened. "I still respect you. I appreciate everything you've done for me. I never wanted you to feel uncomfortable." I sighed, feeling a bit lighter in my C******T, but not completely. There was sincerity in his words and I could feel that, but something still didn't sit right with me. We were both unprepared for this situation. We were both lost in our own feelings and emotions, but his confession brought some clarity. I understood that it wouldn't be easy, but we were on our way to leaving this behind. "We can't just forget about it. Edward the First finally said we have to leave it out of our lives. I don't know how to do that, but we both need to understand that. It's important to move forward." He was silent for a few seconds, as if considering my words. Then he spoke quietly, but firmly, "You're right. I don't know how to do it either, but I promise I'll work on myself. We'll find a way to move forward." The next morning was like usual, foggy, unclear, but still with attempts to restore some semblance of normalcy in our home. Edward was in his place at the table with a cup of coffee, just like in those days when everything was simpler. But everything in him had changed, just as everything in me had. We could no longer just be aunt and nephew. We were people who had gone through something that couldn't be forgotten, but at least we were trying to return to the shadows of our former relationship after our conversation. Several days passed in silence, uncomfortable but still with a minimal attempt to return to the usual order. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking that I missed the old closeness, that simplicity that once existed between us when we could simply sit and laugh, talk about anything without complicated emotions, without the weight that now hung between us like a heavy burden. One evening I decided to make dinner a simple dinner without pretensions, without thoughts about what was happening between us. I placed several dishes on the table, trying to focus on the simple actions, setting the table, arranging the plates, placing everything down. But during the preparation I felt how all of this had become not just a part of the practical routine, but an internal struggle. I wasn't cooking for the three of us. I was cooking to reclaim at least this small piece of the world that once existed between us. When I brought the dishes to the table, he was already sitting there, staring out the window as if he didn't notice me. I wanted to say something casual, something that would bring us back to our familiar state. But I knew that words wouldn't help. We both knew that things would be different. Now I decided that this moment would be when we should at least try to be honest with each other. "Edward," I said, placing his dinner plate in front of him. "I don't know how to do all of this. I don't know how to bring back what was, but I want to try, simply because I don't want to lose what we still can be to each other." He looked up and on his face was the same confusion we had already encountered. But in his eyes I saw something new, understanding. "I don't want to lose you either," he said, his voice firm but carrying some hidden pain, "but I don't know how we can go back. I don't know how we can find that balance." I sat in front of him, feeling how this conversation was opening a new page. For us, it wasn't the resolution of our problem, but a step forward, at least an attempt to understand each other. "We can't go back," I said, and it wasn't bitter, but more of an acceptance. "But maybe we can become something new. We don't have to stay the people we were before. We can be something else. Let's just try to understand what that will be." He nodded, and in that moment I felt a little lighter. We still didn't know how to move forward, but at least in those words, In this simple conversation there was something that made us believe that all was not lost. We didn't know what lay ahead, but we began to realize that we could at least start trying. The next few days passed under the quiet understanding that we would live in this new world. We had created for ourselves a world where there were no clear answers, only attempts to find a way to exist in the conditions we had created. We didn't talk about what had happened between us, and we tried to avoid moments when something old could resurface again. But in this silence there was something important, because we both understood that if we didn't begin to move forward, we would remain forever stuck in this endless pause. One evening when I brought dinner again, he appeared at the threshold of my room as if he were about to say something. He stood there a little awkwardly, arms crossed, and I realized that this moment was inevitable. He couldn't remain silent forever. I also felt that I needed to say something, though I didn't know where to start. "Two would like to talk." He began, his voice steady, but with noticeable tension. "I think we need to understand what this was," he said, his voice softening a little. "I want you to know that what happened wasn't something I intended to do. I never wanted to put you in an awkward situation. Andy didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know what to do either." I replied, trying to speak calmly, but my voice still trembled. I felt how this changed our relationship. "It was difficult for me, but I also want you to know I don't hold any ill will toward you." He looked at me in surprise. There was something touched in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected things to turn out this way. "I've always respected you," he continued. "You were someone I could trust, but now after everything, to have to admit I understand how this changed our relationship. I respect you not only for what you've done for me, but also for what you've been through. We can't go back to what it was." "Edward," I said, feeling the words come out of me almost painfully, "but I still appreciate that you're saying this to me. We both understand that this moment was a mistake, but that doesn't mean we should forget everything that was good." We sat in silence, and in that silence I felt something begin to shift. In our conversation, we were both looking for a way out, trying to find a way to leave the past behind, but not lose ourselves in the process. "I will always be grateful to you," he said, his words quiet but certain, "for everything you've done for me. You gave me so much and I'll never forget it." I lifted my gaze and met his eyes, and in that moment I felt lighter. He was right. We couldn't erase the past, but we could learn to live with it. We could build a relationship even if it meant starting with a clean slate. If you enjoyed this suspenseful story and want to hear more, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more thrilling content. Your support means a lot and helps me create more captivating stories for you. Thank you for being part of this journey.